Edward Miller had never thought of himself as someone who stood out in any way, but the truth was that he had always been different from most of the people who surrounded him in the affluent suburban enclave where he had lived for the last 15 years. At 56 years old, he carried the quiet weight of experience that came from a life filled with both achievements and loss. His late wife, Grace, had been the person who balanced his stoic nature with warmth and laughter, and since her passing 5 years earlier, the world had seemed to move at a pace he was never entirely able to match. Their property sat at the edge of the development, a few acres of land that backed up onto an untamed stretch of woods that a few others in the community appreciated. For Edward, those acres represented freedom. They allowed him to keep a modest workshop, a small orchard he had planted with Grace, and a collection of equipment that most of his neighbors considered out of place in a neighborhood full of manicured lawns and expensive SUVs. Among the pieces of equipment, one stood out as both indispensable and sentimental: a 30-year-old John Deere tractor that had once belonged to his father. The tractor was far from pristine. Its faded green paint was scarred from years of use, and the engine required frequent attention that only Edward could give, but it was reliable. He used it for everything from hauling firewood to maintaining the long gravel drive that separated his home from the nearest paved road. It was not unusual to see Edward working the land well into the evening hours, headlights from the tractor cutting through the dusk as he moved about his property with the quiet purposefulness of a man who preferred tasks he could control over the unpredictable chaos of the outside world. This was part of the reason why Edward often felt disconnected from the rest of the residents. They were the kind of people who valued appearances above substance, who held meetings about fence heights and approved flower colors, who prided themselves on the strict uniformity of the neighborhood. Edward respected their right to live as they wished, but he had little interest in conforming to their rigid expectations, and that quiet refusal to conform had not gone unnoticed. There had always been tension between Edward and the board that managed the affairs of the community, but for the most part he had managed to keep them at arm's length. He paid his dues, kept to himself, and maintained his property, even if it did not look like the others. The board, however, seemed increasingly frustrated with his independence. Over the last year, he had received more than a dozen notices claiming minor violations: grass that was too high, despite being trimmed to a perfectly reasonable length, the presence of a utility trailer temporarily parked near his workshop, the use of gravel rather than paving stones in a small section of his driveway. Edward understood that these notices were more about pressure than about actual infractions, but he dealt with each one methodically, sending responses through certified mail and refusing to allow himself to be intimidated. That quiet war of attrition took a more pointed turn on a gray Tuesday morning in late October when Edward stepped out to retrieve the mail and found a thick envelope marked "Urgent, Final Notice" addressed to him. He opened it as he walked up the gravel path back to the house, his boots crunching on the frost-kissed stones, and by the time he reached his porch his expression had hardened into a mixture of disbelief and anger. The letter claimed that his tractor, the one piece of machinery he could not imagine living without, had been classified as abandoned property under the community's regulations, and that he had 48 hours to remove it from his land. If he failed to do so, the board would arrange for its removal at his expense, and any attempt to interfere would be considered a violation of community rules subject to fines and further legal action. Edward read the letter twice, then a third time, as if repetition might change its meaning. The accusation made no sense. The tractor was parked, as it always was, beside the workshop at the edge of the property. He used it every week, sometimes every day, and it was clearly operable. There was nothing abandoned about it, yet the letter carried the tone of finality, and it was signed not just by the board's president, Donald Quinn, but by their attorney as well. It was not a request, it was a threat dressed in legal language. Edward felt the slow, familiar tightening in his chest that came whenever he was faced with injustice. He was not a man prone to rash decisions, and he had learned long ago that anger was a tool best applied with precision. But even he could not help but feel a spark of outrage at the audacity of what he was reading. The following hours were spent in quiet deliberation. Edward photographed the tractor from multiple angles, making sure to capture the date and timestamps on each image, then printed copies of the letter and placed them in a file with other correspondence he had received from the board over the past year. He knew from experience that documentation was critical when dealing with people who relied on intimidation, and he refused to give them any opportunity to twist the narrative. When he tried to call the number listed at the bottom of the letter, he was met with a recorded message instructing him to submit inquiries in writing. He considered driving to the board's office, but he knew from past interactions that they would likely refuse to meet with him. Instead, he drafted a formal response denying the claim of abandonment and sent it by certified mail, keeping the receipt tucked safely in his records. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, Edward's unease had deepened. He stood by the tractor, running a hand along the cold metal of the hood, and wondered how far the board was willing to go. It was not just about the tractor. He could feel that in his bones. This was about control, about pushing him to either capitulate or leave. He had heard whispers that developers were interested in the land behind his property, and his refusal to sell had been a thorn in the side of those who stood to profit. If they could paint him as non-compliant or negligent, they might have the leverage they needed to force his hand. As he locked up the workshop for the night, Edward could not shake the sense that something was about to happen. The letter had given him 2 days to act, but he had little faith that the board would wait. He thought briefly of calling his neighbor, a retired teacher named Harold who had always been friendly, but decided against it. Harold had his own problems, and Edward did not want to drag anyone else into what was quickly becoming a personal battle. Instead, he resolved to keep a close eye on his property and to be ready for whatever came next. That night, Edward lay awake in bed, listening to the wind move through the trees outside his bedroom window. He thought of Grace and how she had always believed in fairness, in the idea that people could be reasoned with if you simply appealed to their better nature. But he had seen enough of the world to know that some people mistook kindness for weakness. He closed his eyes and reminded himself of the promise he had made long ago when his wife passed, to hold on to the life they had built together, to protect it from anyone who would take it away. He drifted into a restless sleep with that promise echoing in his mind, unaware that the coming days would test it in ways he could never have imagined. The next morning, Edward awoke earlier than usual, the lingering unease from the previous day still pressing at the back of his mind. He dressed quickly, poured himself a cup of black coffee, and went outside to check on the tractor before beginning his day. The sky was overcast, the pale light of dawn washing the property in muted grays, and the ground was damp from a light rain that had fallen overnight. Edward walked down the gravel path toward the workshop, expecting to see the familiar outline of the John Deere where it had been parked for years. Instead, his steps slowed and his heart sank. The spot was empty. The tractor was gone. He stopped in his tracks, staring at the bare patch of earth where the heavy tires had left deep impressions. The soil was disturbed in a way that made it clear the machine had been moved recently, probably with a tow truck. He crouched down and touched the ground. It was still soft from the rain, and the tire tracks led away from the property, toward the main road that connected his land with the rest of the community. Edward stood slowly, his jaw tightening as he tried to process what had happened. They had come for the tractor sooner than even he had anticipated. Edward's first instinct was to walk the length of the driveway to see if anyone was still nearby, but the tracks disappeared as soon as they reached the paved road, merging with the morning traffic. He went back inside, called the local police department, and reported what he believed to be a theft. The dispatcher took his information politely but without any real sense of urgency, asking if he had any idea who might have taken the equipment. Edward explained about the letter from the board, about how they had threatened to remove the tractor, but the dispatcher reminded him that if they had legal authority to do so, It might not be classified as theft. The statement left Edward frustrated, but he maintained his composure and asked that an officer at least come to file a report. While he waited for the police, Edward walked through his workshop, checking for other missing items. Everything else appeared untouched, but the absence of the tractor loomed large. It was not just a machine, it was essential to his way of life. He used it to haul supplies, maintain the driveway, and perform countless other tasks that would be impossible without it. Losing it meant losing control over his property. It was exactly the kind of vulnerability the board had been trying to create. When the police officer arrived, a young man barely in his mid-20s, Edward walked him through the situation in detail. The officer listened, took notes, and photographed the tire tracks, but his tone suggested that he viewed the matter as a civil dispute rather than a crime. He told Edward that the department would need to contact the board to verify whether they had removed the tractor under the authority of the community's regulations. If they had, it would be up to Edward to challenge the action in court. After the officer left, Edward decided to go directly to the board's office, a sterile brick building near the community's entrance. He parked his truck and walked through the glass doors, the receptionist barely glancing up from her computer as he approached. When he asked to speak with Donald Quinn, the board president, she informed him curtly that he would need an appointment. Edward stood his ground, explaining that his property had been taken without his consent, and that he was not leaving until he spoke to someone in authority. Eventually, after an uncomfortable wait in the lobby, Quinn appeared. He was a tall man, with slicked back hair and a permanent air of condescension that seemed to be part of his personality. He greeted Edward with a thin smile that did nothing to conceal the satisfaction in his eyes. "Mr. Miller," he said, "I understand you're upset, but I assure you everything was done according to the rules. Your tractor was removed because it was classified as abandoned property. The paperwork is all in order." Edward clenched his fists but kept his voice steady. "That tractor was not abandoned. I used it every week. You had no right to come onto my property and take it." Quinn shrugged as though Edward's outrage was an inconvenience he would prefer to ignore. "We followed proper procedure. You were notified. We gave you 48 hours, and when you failed to comply, we acted. You're welcome to retrieve the tractor from the storage facility where it's being held, but you'll need to pay the removal fee and sign a release form. Otherwise, it will be disposed of in 30 days. Show me the paperwork," Edward demanded. "Show me the legal authority that gave you the right to step onto my property and remove my equipment." Quinn handed him a copy of a document that made Edward's blood run cold. It was an act of relinquishment, a form stating that Edward had voluntarily surrendered the tractor to the board. At the bottom was a signature that was supposed to be his. Edward stared at it in disbelief. It was a crude forgery, close enough to resemble his handwriting to someone who did not know better, but clearly fake to anyone familiar with his actual signature. "This is a forgery," Edward said quietly, holding up the paper. "I never signed this." Quinn gave another indifferent shrug. "That's not for me to say, Mr. Miller. If you believe there's been a mistake, you're free to pursue legal remedies. But in the meantime, the tractor is no longer your property. I would suggest you not make this more difficult than it needs to be." Edward felt a wave of anger rise in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. He knew that any outburst would only play into Quinn's hands. He folded the document carefully, slipped it into his jacket pocket, and turned to leave without another word. As he stepped out into the cold morning air, he could feel Quinn's gaze following him, smug and calculating. Back at home, Edward called his attorney, a man named Michael Graham, who had handled some minor matters for him in the past. Graham listened intently as Edward explained what had happened, then told him in no uncertain terms to keep every scrap of documentation and avoid any direct confrontation with the board. "They're trying to provoke you," Graham said. "They want you to lose your temper so they can paint you as unreasonable. Don't give them that satisfaction. We'll start by sending a formal demand for the return of the tractor and for a full accounting of how and when it was removed. In the meantime, document everything. Every letter, every call, every interaction. Edward agreed, though the thought of waiting while others held his property was infuriating. That evening he walked the perimeter of his land, looking for any other signs of intrusion. He noticed new tire tracks near the rear boundary, close to the woods, and a section of fence that had been disturbed, as though someone had tried to force it open. He took photographs of everything, adding them to the growing file that Graham would need. As darkness settled over the property, Edward felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This was no longer just about a tractor. It was about power, about a group of people who believed they could rewrite reality to suit their ambitions. He knew they were not going to stop at the tractor, and he understood that he could not face this alone. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider that he might be in for a long and bitter fight, one that would test his patience and resolve in ways he had not experienced since his days in the military. He locked up the workshop, double-checked the doors and windows of the house, and sat at his kitchen table long into the night, reviewing the forged document over and over. The signature stared back at him like a taunt, a reminder that the people he was up against had no qualms about breaking the law if it meant getting what they wanted. Edward poured himself another cup of coffee and made a silent vow. They had started this, but he would make sure they would regret it. Edward woke the next morning to a growing sense of unease that felt heavier than it had the day before, as though the walls around him were closing in. He moved methodically through his morning routine, making coffee, feeding the dog that had adopted him from the woods years earlier, and stepping outside to walk the property. But there was a sharpness to his movements, a tension he could not ignore. The tractor's absence had left a hole that was as much psychological as it was physical. It had been a part of his daily life for decades, and now, every time he walked past the empty space by the workshop, it felt as though someone had broken into his home and stolen a piece of who he was. That sense of violation hardened his resolve. He would not allow himself to be bullied into submission. His attorney, Michael Graham, had already sent a formal demand letter to the board by overnight courier, requesting the immediate return of the tractor and a full explanation of the so-called Relinquishment Act they claimed Edward had signed. Graham had also advised him to file a civil complaint to preserve his legal rights, but Edward knew the wheels of justice would turn slowly. He would need to protect himself in the meantime. That day, he installed new locks on the gates leading into his property and replaced the small security cameras mounted on the corners of the house with larger, more obvious ones, knowing that visibility was sometimes the best deterrent. He also purchased 2 additional cameras to cover the workshop and driveway, ensuring that any future intrusions would be recorded from multiple angles. While working, Edward noticed a car idling on the main road just beyond the boundary of his property. It was a dark sedan with tinted windows, and the driver appeared to be watching him. Edward stood still, staring at the car until it finally rolled away, but the sight left a bitter taste in his mouth. It was not paranoia to think he was being monitored. The board had already shown that they were willing to trespass, and now he was beginning to suspect they might be escalating their tactics. That suspicion was confirmed later that afternoon when a fire marshal arrived unannounced, clipboard in hand, saying he was there to perform a safety inspection. Edward greeted him politely but was immediately wary when the man began wandering the property, noting the location of electrical lines and the presence of flammable materials in the workshop. The marshal cited minor issues. An extension cord, he claimed, was not up to code, a few paint cans stored near a propane tank, and threatened fines if the problems were not corrected. Edward asked whether a complaint had prompted the visit, but the marshal would not answer directly, saying only that routine inspections were conducted randomly. Edward knew better. He documented the entire interaction with his phone, capturing the marshal's comments on video, and made sure to request a written report of any alleged violations. The very next day, a representative from the county's Environmental Services Department appeared, claiming to be investigating a complaint about improper disposal of hazardous waste on Edward's property. The accusation was absurd. Edward had always been meticulous about waste disposal, but the official combed through the workshop and outbuildings anyway, photographing everything in sight. Edward remained calm, answering the questions politely but making it clear he knew his rights. He refused entry into areas not covered by the complaint, and when the official left, Edward added another set of notes and photographs to the growing file he was keeping for his attorney. By the end of the week, Edward had received 3 separate citations, one from the fire marshal, one from Environmental Services, and one from the building inspector, who arrived 2 days later to declare that a portion of the fence near the rear boundary violated height restrictions. Each citation carried a fine, and although the amounts were not individually catastrophic, the cumulative effect was obvious. The board was trying to bury him in bureaucratic pressure to force him into submission through a steady drumbeat of official-looking threats. Edward refused to break. He contacted Graham after each visit, forwarding copies of the citations and asking him to file appeals where appropriate. Graham advised Edward to avoid any direct confrontation with the board members themselves, warning that they might try to provoke him into saying or doing something they could use against him. Edward took that advice seriously, though it was difficult. He saw Quinn twice in passing at the community's entrance, and each time the man offered him a smug smile that made Edward's blood boil. One evening, as Edward was locking up the workshop, he heard voices near the front gate. He grabbed a flashlight and walked up the driveway quietly, staying in the shadows until he was close enough to see 2 men standing just outside the gate, speaking in low tones. One of them was pointing toward the house. When Edward stepped into the light and called out, the men froze, then quickly retreated to a waiting pickup truck and drove off without saying a word. Edward noted the license plate and gave it to Graham the next morning, asking him to find out who the truck belonged to. The psychological pressure was beginning to wear on him. At night, he would hear sounds outside, branches snapping, the crunch of gravel, and wonder if someone was lurking in the dark. He started keeping the dog inside after dusk, worried that someone might try to harm the animal to send a message. He also began carrying his old service pistol on his belt whenever he was outside, though he prayed he would never have reason to use it. Graham, seeing how far the board was willing to go, filed for an injunction to prevent any further action against Edward's property until the matter of the tractor and the forged documents could be resolved. The court granted a temporary order, which at least gave Edward some breathing room, but he knew it would not stop the board from trying to intimidate him. He could feel the tension in every interaction with neighbors, many of whom had started avoiding him entirely. He suspected the board had been spreading rumors about him, painting him as unstable or dangerous, and the cold glances he received at the grocery store or gas station only reinforced that suspicion. Despite the isolation, Edward found small moments of encouragement. One afternoon, an older neighbor named Martha stopped by to quietly tell him that she believed what was happening to him was wrong. She had received her own share of questionable citations over the years and suspected the board was targeting property owners they thought could be bullied into selling. Her words were a rare kindness, and although she admitted she was too frightened to get involved publicly, her support meant more than she realized. Edward continued to strengthen his position, both legally and practically. He backed up all of his security camera footage onto an external hard drive and gave a copy to Graham, along with the growing stack of letters, citations, and photographs. He invested in better lighting for the property and even installed motion-activated alarms on the gates. He refused to be caught off guard again. Still, he knew that the fight was far from over. Every day brought a new challenge, and every challenge carried the potential for escalation. Edward understood that he was up against people who believed they were untouchable, who thought they could bend the system to their will without consequence. But he also understood something they had not considered. He was not a man who surrendered easily. He had survived worse than this, and if they wanted a war of attrition, he was prepared to outlast them. As he stood on his porch one evening, looking out at the quiet darkness of the woods beyond his land, Edward felt a steely calm settle over him. He knew the next move would not be his to make. The board had already shown their willingness to cross lines, and he had no doubt they would try again. But the next time they came for him, he would be ready. Edward's patience was being tested with a relentlessness that left him drained at the end of every day. Yet he refused to give in to despair. He had spent the better part of 2 weeks fortifying his legal case with Michael Graham, filing appeals for the fabricated citations and documenting every suspicious occurrence around his property. But there had been no movement from the board on returning the tractor or even acknowledging that the Relinquishment Act was forged. The silence was deliberate and calculated, a tactic designed to wear him down, and Edward knew that if he simply waited, he would lose ground. Graham was competent and persistent, but even he admitted that cases like this could drag on for months, if not years, before any resolution was reached in court. Edward could not allow them to dictate the pace of the conflict because every delay only emboldened them further. One morning, Graham called with the first real development since the tractor had been taken. "We pulled property transaction records from the county office," he said, his tone heavy with implication. "Edward, your name is still on the deed to your land, but I'm seeing multiple conditional agreements tied to it that were filed without your knowledge. One of those agreements lists your property as collateral for a proposed infrastructure project, and it's signed by the board as though they have controlling authority." Edward gripped the phone tighter as Graham continued. "And it gets worse. The same names that signed off on your supposed relinquishment document are on these agreements. One of them is a woman named Leslie Baker, who, from what I can tell, passed away in 2019. Edward felt a surge of anger mixed with grim vindication. The forged signature had already made it clear that the board was willing to falsify documents, but this revelation confirmed the broader scope of their scheme. They were leveraging other people's properties as if they owned them, gambling with assets that weren't theirs, and likely profiting from the transactions in ways that would be difficult to trace. He asked Graham to send him copies of everything and resolved to visit the county records office himself. The next day, Edward drove to the courthouse and spent hours combing through paper files and digital archives, quietly verifying the documents Graham had mentioned. The deeper he looked, the clearer the pattern became. There were at least a dozen properties tied up in similar agreements, most of them belonging to older residents or those who lived alone. Edward recognized several names, including Martha, the neighbor who had confided in him. He printed everything he could and left the courthouse with a thick stack of evidence under his arm. As he stepped outside, he found himself face to face with Donald Quinn. The board president stood at the bottom of the courthouse steps as though he had been waiting for him, a thin smile curling at the corners of his mouth. "Digging through old records, Mr. Miller?" Quinn asked casually, though his eyes were cold. "I hope you're not wasting too much of your time. There's nothing there for you." Edward stared at him, choosing his words carefully. "I don't know what you think you're doing, Quinn, but it's over. You've gone too far, and when this comes to light, it won't just be my attorney you're answering to." Quinn stepped closer, lowering his voice so that only Edward could hear. "You're making a mistake if you think anyone's going to care about a few pieces of paper. We run this community, and no one is going to take your side when you've made yourself into a problem. Sell the property, take the money, and walk away while you still can." Edward didn't respond. He simply turned and walked to his truck, gripping the steering wheel tightly as he drove away. Quinn's words had been delivered with quiet menace, and Edward knew the man was not bluffing. He had already seen the lengths they were willing to go. That night, Edward shared the documents with Graham, who immediately began drafting a motion to compel the board to produce all records related to the agreements. "This is bigger than your tractor," Graham said. "If we can prove they've been using people's properties as collateral without consent, we'll have them in a corner, but you need to be careful. They know you're onto them now, and I don't trust how they'll react." The following days proved Graham's warning was justified. Edward noticed cars lingering near his property late at night, their headlights cutting briefly through the trees before vanishing down the road. Twice he found footprints near the back gate, deep impressions from boots that didn't belong to him. He doubled his security measures, adding motion-activated floodlights around the workshop and upgrading the locks again, but the sense of being watched was inescapable. Then came the board meeting. Graham encouraged him to attend, not to confront anyone directly, but to observe. Edward arrived early, taking a seat near the back of the brightly lit community center where the meeting was held. Quinn presided at the front of the room, flanked by the other board members, and the agenda moved briskly through items about landscaping budgets and holiday decorations. Edward waited patiently, but it wasn't long before his name came up. A woman stood and raised a complaint about eyesores in the community, specifically citing Edward's workshop and abandoned vehicles as examples. It was clear the complaint had been planted, a setup designed to publicly vilify him. Quinn seized the opportunity, solemnly explaining that the board had been forced to act against Edward because he had refused to comply with repeated requests to maintain his property in accordance with community standards. Murmurs of disapproval rippled through the crowd, and Edward felt a familiar heat rising in his chest, but he forced himself to stay seated, his face unreadable. When the floor was opened for comments, Edward stood slowly, his height commanding silence. He didn't raise his voice, but every word carried weight. "For the record," he said evenly, "I did not abandon my property. My tractor was taken without my consent, using a forged document, and I now have evidence that similar forgeries have been used against other property owners. Some of you may want to look at your own records carefully before you assume the board has your best interest at heart." He held up a copy of one of the agreements, the forged signature clearly visible, and placed it on the table at the front before walking out. The room buzzed with whispered conversations as he left, and Edward knew he had struck a nerve. He didn't expect anyone to rally to his side immediately, but he had planted a seed of doubt. If even a handful of residents began questioning the board's actions, Quinn would lose the blanket of silence he relied on. When Edward returned home, he felt a flicker of cautious optimism for the first time in weeks. He had evidence, he had legal backing, and he had shown the board that he was not afraid to stand his ground. But he also knew that Quinn would not take this lightly. As Edward sat on his porch that evening, the cold wind rustling the trees, he could not shake the feeling that the next move would be the board's, and that it would be more aggressive than anything they had tried so far. Edward woke the next day with the sense that the fragile line he had drawn between his own life and the growing hostility of the board was about to shatter. The memory of the community meeting, the way Quinn's face had darkened when Edward left the forged agreement on the table for all to see, lingered in his mind like the distant rumble of an approaching storm. He spent the early hours walking the perimeter of his property, checking the locks on his gates, ensuring the motion lights were functional, and verifying that the cameras he had installed days earlier were still online and recording. The cold November wind cut sharply through his jacket, but he did not rush the inspection. Every step was deliberate. He had learned the hard way that carelessness was the quickest path to disaster. Shortly after midday, a knock came at the door. Edward opened it cautiously to find a deputy sheriff standing on his porch, holding a folded envelope. The man's expression was neutral, but guarded, as though he was bracing for a confrontation. "Mr. Miller?" the deputy asked. Edward nodded, and the man handed him the envelope. "You've been served," he said simply before turning and walking back to his patrol car. Edward closed the door and unfolded the documents inside. It was a formal notice of a pending hearing to revoke his right to occupy his property, filed by the board on the grounds that his land was in violation of multiple safety and environmental regulations, and that he was creating a nuisance, detrimental to the community. The hearing was scheduled for less than 2 weeks away, and if the board succeeded, they could have him forcibly removed pending further legal review. Edward sat down at the kitchen table and read the notice 3 times. The language was carefully chosen, designed to paint him as a danger to the community, and it was backed up by the same citations the fire marshal, environmental services, and building inspector had issued in recent weeks. He called Graham immediately, and the attorney confirmed what Edward already suspected. The hearing was a tactical move, a way to pressure him into either selling or vacating before the broader scheme with the forged documents could be exposed. "They're escalating because you're a threat now," Graham said grimly. "But this also means they're making mistakes. They're moving too fast, and that gives us an opportunity. I'll file a motion to delay the hearing and demand full disclosure of their evidence. In the meantime, you need to prepare for the possibility that they'll try something outside the legal process." That night, Edward set up camp in the workshop, unwilling to leave his property unattended. The hum of the security cameras and the creak of the old building settling in the wind kept him awake. Around 2 a.m, he heard the faint crunch of tires on gravel. He stepped outside quietly, his breath clouding in the cold air, and saw headlights approaching from the rear access road that bordered the woods. The truck slowed as it reached his back gate, and Edward could make out 2 silhouettes inside. He raised his flashlight, aiming the beam directly at the truck, and shouted for them to identify themselves. The engine revved, and the vehicle reversed quickly down the road, vanishing into the trees. Edward checked the gate and found the lock had been tampered with. He replaced it immediately and reviewed the camera footage which captured the truck's license plate as it fled. He sent the video to Graham first thing in the morning, and the attorney promised to pass it along to the sheriff's office. The following days brought more intimidation. Anonymous phone calls came at all hours, the line going dead as soon as Edward answered. He found a dead animal, his neighbor Martha's missing cat, left at the base of his driveway with a note pinned to its collar that read, "Leave while you can." The sight left Edward sick to his stomach, but he buried the animal respectfully and added the note to his growing file of evidence. He knew the board would deny any involvement, but he also knew that fear was their preferred weapon. He refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. Graham's efforts to delay the hearing were partially successful. The judge granted an extension of 3 weeks, but the motion for disclosure was denied, meaning Edward would not know the full extent of the board's accusations until the hearing itself. The delay bought them time, but Edward understood it would only intensify the board's efforts to force him out. That understanding was reinforced when he returned home from a supply run one afternoon to find the front gate hanging open and the word "traitor" spray-painted across the side of his workshop. Inside, tools were missing, drawers overturned, and one of the security cameras had been ripped from the wall. Whoever had broken in knew how to avoid the remaining cameras, leaving Edward with no clear footage of the perpetrators. He called the sheriff's office again, and a deputy came out to take a report, but the man's demeanor made it clear he believed Edward was caught in a neighborhood feud that law enforcement had little interest in resolving. "You might want to think about moving, Mr. Miller," the deputy said quietly as he packed up his notepad. "These things have a way of escalating." We can't be everywhere. Edward stood in the ruined workshop long after the deputy left, his jaw clenched. He felt as though he were fighting an invisible enemy, one that operated in shadows and smiled in public. He considered calling Martha to check on her, but he did not want to put her at further risk. Instead, he called Graham, who urged him once again to stay calm and let the legal process unfold. "You've got enough evidence now to raise serious questions about what they're doing," Graham said. "Don't take the bait. That's what they want. They want you to lash out so they can use it against you at the hearing." The advice was sound, but it did little to ease the constant pressure. Edward slept lightly, waking at every noise, and during the day he kept his pistol within reach. One evening, just before sunset, he received an unexpected visitor. A man in his 30s approached the property on foot, carrying a small briefcase and wearing a worn business suit. He introduced himself as Daniel Ross, a former contractor who had done work for the board in the past. "I don't want any trouble," Ross said, glancing nervously at the cameras mounted along the house. "But I heard what they're doing to you, and I can't keep quiet anymore. They did the same thing to another client of mine last year. took his property on a forged lien and flipped it to a developer for triple the value. I have copies of the work orders and some emails that prove they were coordinating with the developer before they even filed the liens. If you can use this to stop them, I'll give it to you, but you can't tell anyone where it came from." Edward listened carefully, asking questions to verify Ross's story. The man's fear was palpable, and Edward believed him. He accepted the briefcase and promised to keep Ross's identity confidential. Inside were printed emails, invoices, and signed agreements that linked the board to a real estate investment group with a history of aggressive acquisitions. It was the most concrete evidence Edward had seen yet, and it confirmed what he had suspected all along. The tractor, the forged documents, the fabricated citations, all of it was part of a larger scheme to seize properties and sell them for profit. He called Graham immediately, and the attorney's reaction was swift. "This changes everything," Graham said. "We can use this to file a criminal complaint. I'll take it to the district attorney myself. But Edward, you need to be extra careful now. If they even suspect you have this, they'll come after you hard." That night, Edward did something he had been considering for weeks. He drove the truck down to the impound facility where the tractor was being held, accompanied by a county deputy who had agreed to act on Graham's emergency motion for the release of property pending litigation. The motion had been granted quietly that afternoon, and the facility had no choice but to comply. The tractor was loaded onto the flatbed trailer Edward had borrowed from a friend of Graham's, and by the time he pulled up to his property, the sky was black and the cold air bit at his hands through his gloves. Instead of returning the tractor to its usual spot by the workshop, Edward drove straight to the board's office building. The parking lot was empty at that hour, and the interior lights of the building glowed faintly through the large glass windows of the lobby. Edward positioned the trailer directly in front of the entrance, lowered the ramp, and slowly drove the tractor off the trailer and up to the glass doors. He shut off the engine, climbed down, and set the keys on the receptionist's desk just inside the lobby before walking back out. The doors had been unlocked, a careless oversight by whoever closed up, and Edward took advantage of it. He left a neatly written note with the keys. "Returned property. See you at the hearing." He didn't linger. The cameras mounted on the building would capture the entire act, and he wanted them to. He wanted Quinn and the other board members to see the tractor sitting in the center of their pristine lobby when they arrived in the morning, a silent testament to the fact that he would not be intimidated. He secured the doors on his way out, reloaded the trailer, and drove home in silence, his heart pounding but his mind steady. When he awoke the next morning, his phone was buzzing with calls from Graham. The attorney's voice was tight with both admiration and concern. "You made your point, Edward, but they're going to be furious. I just got word they're calling an emergency meeting tonight. Be ready for anything, because you've humiliated them, and they're not the type to take that lightly." Edward thanked him and hung up, stepping outside to watch the frost melting from the grass as the sun climbed higher in the sky. He knew Graham was right. The board would see his act not just as defiance but as a direct challenge to their authority, and he also knew that they would strike back, harder than ever. He could only hope that the evidence Ross had provided, combined with the mountain of documentation he had gathered, would be enough to finally turn the tide when the inevitable confrontation came. The morning of the hearing arrived with a chill in the air that matched the growing tension inside Edward's chest. He had spent the night going over the details one last time, reviewing the documents, the emails from Daniel Ross, the copies of the forged agreements, and the security footage that had captured his tractor being taken from his property. Everything was in place. But the reality of facing the board in a public forum was different from preparing in the quiet solitude of his home. He knew they would come at him hard, not just with legal maneuvering, but with the full weight of their collective power. Quinn would not let this go without a fight, and Edward had no illusions about the kind of tactics they were capable of using. He arrived early at the community center, the building where the hearing was to take place. The room was filled with chairs for the residents, many of whom were already seated, whispering among themselves. Edward recognized a few faces, including Martha, who sat near the back, her eyes avoiding his as though she were afraid to be seen in support of him. As he walked into the room, he could feel the weight of the room's judgment falling on him. The board members were already seated at the front, Donald Quinn at the center, flanked by the others whose names had appeared in the documents Edward had uncovered. Their faces were masks of cold professionalism, but Edward could see the flicker of anxiety in their eyes as they glanced at the stack of papers in front of them. They had expected him to back down, to sell, to disappear, but instead he had done something they hadn't anticipated. He had fought back. Edward took a seat at the front of the room, his posture straight and his hands folded on the table in front of him. He had prepared for this moment for weeks, but now that it was here, he found that the nerves had not left him. His pulse raced, but he was determined not to let it show. He had nothing to lose anymore, and that realization gave him a strange sense of clarity. The board, on the other hand, seemed increasingly unsettled. The air between them crackled with a tension that was hard to ignore. Quinn began the proceedings with his usual condescending tone, opening the hearing with formalities that seemed designed to paint Edward as a nuisance. This hearing is being held to address the continued violations of community standards by Mr. Edward Miller, who has failed to maintain his property according to the guidelines set forth by the association. Quinn began, his eyes briefly flicking toward Edward, though he made no effort to look him directly in the face. Mr. Miller has received numerous warnings regarding his conduct, and despite these efforts, he continues to flout the rules. We are here to determine the next steps in this ongoing matter, including the possibility of removing Mr. Miller from his property due to his inability to comply with community standards. Edward knew this was coming. Quinn's words were sharp and deliberate, aimed at framing him as an obstacle to the community's progress. But Edward was ready. He stood up slowly, his voice calm but carrying enough weight to command attention. "For the record," he said, "I did not refuse to comply. I received no notice, no warning, and no opportunity to contest the accusations made against me before my property was taken." There was a brief murmur in the room, and Quinn's face tightened as he prepared to respond, but Edward cut him off. "What I did receive was a forged document claiming that I had abandoned my tractor. That document was presented to me as if it were legitimate, but it was not. It was falsified. I have evidence to prove it. I also have evidence of other properties being taken through similar forgeries, and I intend to make this public if necessary." Edward pulled the stack of papers from his briefcase, laying them on the table in front of him. He passed copies to the board members, making sure to include the email correspondences, the forged agreements, and the transaction records that tied the board to a real estate development company. Quinn's mask of professionalism cracked for just a moment as he glanced at the papers, his jaw tightening. The other board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly caught off guard. "I also have security footage of my tractor being removed from my property without my permission, along with a video of my gate being tampered with," Edward continued, his voice unwavering. "If you want to dispute the facts, I will gladly show the footage in court, where it will be subjected to the scrutiny of a judge and jury." Quinn regained his composure quickly, but the discomfort in the room was palpable. "Mr. Miller, you are making wild accusations," he said, his voice dripping with forced calm. "These documents are irrelevant, and your actions today are nothing more than a smear campaign against the board. You are in violation of community standards, and the only reason this hearing is happening is because of your refusal to cooperate. We did everything by the book. You are the one who's brought this conflict to a head." Edward's eyes narrowed. "The book you're referring to is a document I've never seen. You presented me with a forged version of my own signature on an agreement I never signed. You and the other members of this board have been using forged liens to manipulate property owners into giving up their land, and I have the proof right here." The room was silent as Edward's words sank in. Quinn's attempt to reassert control faltered as the board members exchanged glances, realizing they were facing something they could no longer ignore. Edward could see the tension in their posture, the subtle shift from confident authority to uneasy defensiveness. The hearing had not gone as they had planned, and for the first time since this ordeal began, it seemed as though the tables were turning. As the board members huddled together in a quiet, tense discussion, Edward leaned back in his chair, keeping his eyes on Quinn. He knew the man would try to spin things in his favor, to play the victim, but Edward had made his point. The truth was out, and no amount of legal maneuvering could erase the facts. But Quinn wasn't done yet. He stood and cleared his throat, a practiced smile returning to his face. "Mr. Miller, while I acknowledge that your accusations are concerning," Quinn began, "I believe they are based on misunderstandings. There's no need to make this a public matter. The matter of the tractor and your property can be resolved through private negotiation." Edward shook his head. "It's too late for that. You've already crossed the line. I'll take this to the press, I'll take it to the courts, and I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what you've been doing to residents of this community. You've underestimated me, Quinn, and you've underestimated how far I'm willing to go to protect what's mine." Before Quinn could respond, one of the board members, a middle-aged woman named Sylvia Jennings, stood up. She had been quiet throughout most of the hearing, but her voice was strong when she spoke. "Donald," she said, addressing Quinn directly, "I think it's time we take a step back. These documents, these accusations, they're serious. We can't just brush them aside. I suggest we suspend this hearing until we've had a chance to investigate further." There was a long pause as the room waited for Quinn's reaction. His face flushed with a mixture of anger and frustration, but it was clear that he knew Sylvia was right. The evidence Edward had presented could not be ignored, and the board's reputation was at risk. Quinn stood frozen for a moment before speaking again, his voice cold. "We'll reconvene in private," he said, his eyes narrowing at Edward. "But make no mistake, Mr. Miller, this isn't over. You've made your point, but we will fight you every step of the way." Edward nodded, unshaken. "Then let's take this all the way, Quinn. I'm ready." As the hearing adjourned and the board members filed out of the room, Edward stood tall, knowing that for the first time in this entire ordeal, he had won a significant victory. The board was rattled and their grip on the community was slipping. The documents Ross had given him were the key to exposing the corruption at the heart of the board's dealings. And now, with the community seeing the truth, Quinn's empire of control would start to crumble. The battle wasn't over, but Edward had taken the first step toward winning it, and he would not back down. As he walked out of the community center, his heart was light for the first time in weeks. He had faced them head-on, and he had made them blink. The storm was far from over, but for the first time in a long while Edward felt confident that he could weather it. In the weeks that followed the hearing, Edward's life took on a strange rhythm. The board had retreated into its shell, at least for now, no longer making the overt threats that had plagued him for months. Still, the air between him and the rest of the community was thick with suspicion. Some neighbors had started speaking to him again, offering quiet words of support, but many still avoided eye contact, unwilling to risk angering the board. The coldness of it was palpable, but it didn't matter to Edward. He had his land, his rights, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that away from him. Graham, despite his cautious optimism, had warned Edward that it wasn't over. The board would regroup, and they would fight back. In the weeks since the hearing, he had filed for a full investigation into the forged documents, as well as a civil lawsuit against the board members for the illegal removal of his property. But the wheels of justice moved slowly, and Edward knew that it would take time for anything substantive to happen. His patience, honed over decades of military service and the quiet years with Grace, was the only thing keeping him from breaking under the weight of it all. One afternoon, as Edward was working in the orchard, he received a call from Graham. The attorney's voice, usually calm and measured, was tense. "Edward," he said, "the DA is opening an investigation into the board. They've found the links between the board members and the development company. They've even traced some of the properties to off-the-books transactions that were clearly intended to avoid public scrutiny. You've got the momentum now, but you need to be careful. They're not going down without a fight." Edward felt a wave of cautious relief. For months he had been pushing for this very thing, but hearing the words spoken out loud made it feel real. The board and its network of corruption was unraveling. But Graham was right. The battle wasn't over. In fact, it was about to get even more dangerous. As the investigation unfolded, new details came to light. The development company linked to the board had been operating under the radar for years, quietly purchasing properties using falsified documents, often preying on elderly or vulnerable homeowners who had no knowledge of what was happening until it was too late. The scope of the fraud was staggering, and Edward was at the heart of it. The emails Ross had provided had turned out to be the key that unlocked the entire operation. The DA had already brought in several key witnesses, including former contractors who had worked with the board but had been silenced through threats or financial manipulation. As the pieces of the puzzle began to come together, the community's perception of the board shifted. Quinn and his cronies were no longer untouchable figures. They were criminals, and their empire was about to crumble. Despite this, Edward knew better than to let his guard down. Quinn, like any desperate man backed into a corner, would lash out, and it was clear that the board still had the resources to make trouble for him. As the investigation continued, Edward noticed an uptick in the strange, subtle occurrences that had begun months ago. Cars were still showing up at the edges of his property late at night, their occupants staying just long enough to let him know they were watching. The anonymous calls started again, always with the same harsh, static-filled silence. And then, one evening, just after the sun had dipped below the horizon, Edward received a warning that chilled him to the bone. A neighbor, one who had been supportive of his fight against the board, called to tell him that someone had been going door to door in the neighborhood, asking if anyone had seen anything strange around his property recently. It was an obvious attempt to intimidate the residents into silence, and Edward knew that it meant the board was feeling the pressure. They had no intention of losing their grip on the community without one last, desperate attempt to break him. Edward called Graham immediately, and the attorney advised him to stay vigilant but not to engage directly. "You've already shown them you're not backing down, but now it's about strategy. The board is on the defensive, and that's where you need them. Let the investigation run its course. If they do anything rash, we'll be ready to respond." But as the days passed, Edward grew more uneasy. He felt the weight of every noise in the night, the stillness of the house, the eerie sense that something was waiting just beyond the edge of his property. He installed new security measures, more lights, more cameras, and kept a close watch on the woods surrounding his land. The feeling of being hunted, of having his every move scrutinized, was becoming unbearable. Then, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, as Edward was sitting on his porch watching the late autumn leaves fall, he saw a figure walking up the gravel drive toward his front gate. At first, he thought it was just another resident trying to avoid eye contact, but as the figure drew closer, he recognized the familiar silhouette. It was Martha, the neighbor who had once given him quiet support. She was walking slowly, her shoulders hunched as though weighed down by something heavy. When she reached the gate, she looked around nervously before pulling a folded piece of paper from her jacket pocket and handing it to Edward. "Edward," she said quietly, "I don't know what this will mean, but I had to give it to you." She quickly turned and walked away without another word, disappearing into the growing dusk. Edward unfolded the paper and saw that it was a letter, written in a hand that looked hurried and distressed. It was from one of the board members, a man named James Rollins, and it contained an offer that made Edward's blood run cold. "We know you have the evidence, Miller. We also know that this fight is far from over. We're willing to offer you a deal. Walk away from this, drop the charges, and we'll make sure you walk away with a significant payout. No more fighting, no more hassle. Just take the money and leave. If you don't, well, let's just say the next step won't be so easy." Edward's hands trembled as he read the letter. It was a threat, no doubt about it, but it was also an invitation. The board was trying to buy him off, trying to end the fight on their terms. They had underestimated him before, and now they were underestimating him again. He folded the letter and put it in his pocket, his resolve hardening. There was no way he would back down now. That evening, Edward called Graham, informing him of the offer and the veiled threat contained in the letter. The attorney's response was swift and blunt. "This is it, Edward. They're desperate. They're trying to intimidate you, but they're also giving you the final push you need. I'm filing for a restraining order tomorrow. If they try anything like that again, it's over for them. They can't bully you anymore." Edward agreed, his determination solidifying into something fierce. He knew that this was the final stretch, the last chance the board had to salvage what little control they had left. He could feel it now, the endgame drawing closer. There would be no more offers, no more deals. It was all or nothing. In the weeks that followed, the board's efforts to undermine Edward became more erratic. They attempted to delay the legal proceedings to intimidate witnesses, but it was too late. The tide had already turned. The investigation into their illegal activities gained momentum, and the truth began to surface in ways they could not deny. The more they tried to cover their tracks, the more their actions exposed the depth of their corruption. In the end, it was the sheer weight of the evidence, combined with the support of the community that began to rally behind Edward, that broke the board. One by one, the members began to backpedal, either resigning under pressure or facing charges of their own. Quinn, the ringleader, was forced to step down as president, his influence slipping away as the district attorney moved forward with criminal charges. The community, long held in thrall by his charm and manipulation, finally saw him for what he was, a predator, preying on the vulnerability of its residents for profit. As for Edward, he stood firm in the face of every challenge, knowing that he had fought not just for his own